The taking of Fort Henry happened on February 6, 1862. Fort Henry was located on the Tennessee River. The week before, General Grant had proposed a general forward movement. He wrote this brief letter to Major General Halleck. With permission, I will take Fort Henry on the Tennessee, and will establish and hold a large camp there. A week back, Halleck had told McClellan that the advance up the rivers should not be undertaken by a force of less than 60,000 effectives. Grant had barely one-third that many men. However, leery as Halleck was of the wild men of Belmont, he knew that when Grant said plainly, "I will take Fort Henry," it meant an all-out effort and quick movement from field-hardened troops. In the lead were 4 ironclad gunboats, unlike any ever seen before on this or any river. They were the invention, the product, and at this stage the property, of James B. Eads, who had built them in 100 days on an Army contract let to him in August, when they were intended, along with 3 others, to constitute the hard core of the column that would accomplish Fremont's looping descent of the Mississippi. The Pathfinder was now gone, along with his plan, but the gunboats remained. They were 175 feet long and a bit over 50 feet in the beam. 2 1/2-inch overlapping plates of armor were bolted to the bows to give protection from head-on fire, and the sides were slooped with 35° to deflect shots taken broadside. For armaments, they amounted 13 guns apiece, 3 at the bow, 2 at the stern, and 4 on each side. Despite the weight of all this metal, they were surprisingly maneuverable and drew only 6 feet of water, which meant, in river parlance, they could run on a heavy dew. Leading the Union Navy was a tough, deeply religious man who hated slavery and whiskey. His name was Commodore Andrew H. Foote. Foote, like Grant, believed in combined operations, and had joined with him in bombarding Halleck with telegrams urging the undertaking of this one. Army and Navy, the Commodore said, were like blades of shears, united, invincible, separated, almost useless. So built, so manned and led, the fleet put out in a rainy early February darkness, southward up the swollen Tennessee. 4 ironclads and 3 wooden gunboats escorting 9 transports with their cargo of blue-clad soldiers, the first of Grant's 2 divisions, which together totaled 15,000 men. Having landed the first, the transports would return downriver to bring the second forward. Then, the 2 would move together against the fort, the gunboats meanwhile taking it under bombardment. The initial problem was to locate the landing place as near the objective as possible, and yet beyond the range of its guns. One complication was Panther Creek, which flowed westward into the river. A little over 3 miles north of the fort, a landing north of the creek would mean that the troops would have to cross or go around it. That was undesirable, involving problematic delay. Yet a landing south of the creek might bring the transports under the rebel guns, with reluctant havoc and probable disaster. Grant must first determine their range, so he did, characteristically, in the quickest, simplest way, by personal reconnaissance. Having the fleet in the cold pre-dawn darkness 8 miles short of the fort, he ordered 3 of the ironclads forward to draw the fire of the guns, and boarded one of them, the Essex, to go along and find out for himself. He found out soon enough. The ironclads steamed past the creek mouth and opened fire within 2 miles of the fort. The answering shells fell short until a 6-inch rifle came into action, splashing its first shot not only beyond the gunboat, but beyond the mouth of the creek as well. Grant now had the information he wanted. No landing could be made south of the creek without bringing the transports under fire. But then the rifle's gunner made the information even more emphatic by demonstrating the kind of marksmanship the gunboats would encounter in an attack against Fort Henry. Shortening the range, he put the next shot squarely into the Essex. Having secured the information they sought and more, the ironclads turned and went back down the river, the wounded Essex bringing up the rear with a 6-inch shell in her steerage and a wiser troop commander on her bridge. Now that he knew how to do what must be done, Grant went back to get the movement started. The fleet proceeded southward, landing the 1st Division north of the creek, and while the empty transports set out downriver on their 100-mile round trip to bring the 2nd Division forward, he completed the details of his attack plan. The key to the position he saw, Belmont having taught him just how briefly troops could hold an objective which came under plunging fire of enemy guns, was the high ground on the west bank, dominating the low-lying fort across the river. Reconnaissance had drawn no fire from there, and Grant had been able to spot no guns through his glasses, but that was inconclusive. Intelligence had warned him that the Confederates were at work there. The batteries might be masked, under orders to hold their fire until the target worth their powder hove in view. Therefore, he assigned the 2nd Division the task of seizing the left bank heights, planting artillery there, while the 1st Division moved against the fort itself, angling around the head of Panther Creek to come in from the east and thus prevent the escape of the garrison in case it tried to retreat from under the fleet bombardment. On the Confederate side, Lloyd Tillman and his 3,400 men were miserably armed with hunting rifles, shotguns, and 1812-style flintlocks, and his cannon were scarcely better. 2 out of the shipmen cast from what looked like pot metal had burst in target practice, and several others had been condemned, a British observer pronouncing them less dangerous to the enemy than to the men who served them. Tillman was threatened, in fact, by more than gunboats and blue-clad infantry, and weakened by more than the shortage of serviceable arms. In 1 week, back in mid-January, when the rains came, the river had risen 14 feet, demonstrating graphically the unwisdom of the engineers who had sited Fort Henry at this particular bend of the Tennessee. Only 9 of the 15 guns bearing riverwood remained above water in early February, and now, while the river continued to rise, lapping at last at the magazines, it had become a question of which would get there first, Flood Crest or the Yankees. Despite all of this, the Kentucky brigadier did not despair when his lookouts, peering downriver through the rainy dawn of the 4th, announced the approach of gunboats, and behind them the coal smoke plumes of the transports winding northward out of sight. Determined to fight, he wired Polk for reinforcements from Columbus, and the following day, having turned back the ironclad reconnaissance and seen that the Federals were landing in force 3 miles north of the fort, he wired Johnson at Bowling Green, "If you could reinforce strongly and quickly, we have a glorious chance to overwhelm the enemy." Accordingly, he sent his troops with their squirrely guns and fowling pieces to man the rifle pits blocking the landward approaches. If no one came, he would fight with what he had. However, as the day wore on and the transports returned with further relays of Northern troops, he began to realize the full length of the odds, particularly on the opposite bank, where the Union brigades were landing and preparing to move against the unfinished, unmanned works on the high ground which dominated the shipwrecked fort of the side. Without losing his resolution to give battle, he saw clearly that whoever stood on this nailhead under the swing of that sledge was going to be destroyed. And he saw, too, whatever his personal inclination, his military duty was to save what he could of a command whose doom was all but sealed. At a council of war called that night in the fort, the Union buildup continued, seemingly endless. 3 miles downriver on both banks, he announced his decision. While a sacrificed garrison manned whatever guns were yet above water, discouraging pursuit, the infantry would be evacuated, marching overland to join the troops at Donelson. The next morning, a company of Tennessee artillery, 2 officers and 54 men, took their posts at the guns, awaiting the attack that they knew was coming, while the foot soldiers filed out of the rifle pits and the fort, taking the road eastward. The flagship will, of course, open the fire, Foote had ordered, and at 1,700 yards she did so. Others joined the chorus, firing as many as their 54 guns as could be brought to bear on the fort, whose 9 gun crews stood to their pieces and replied at once in kind, losing what one defender proudly called as pretty and as simultaneous a broadside as I had ever saw flashed from the sides of a frigate. This continued, preceded by one broad and leaping sheet of flame. As the same defender said, the ironclads deliberately closed the range to 600 yards, while the more vulnerable wooden vessels hugged the western bank, adding the weight to their metal to the pressure of the earthworks. Based as it was on predetermined ranges, fire from the fort was accurate and fast. For a time at least, the Tennessee artillerists seemed to be inflicting the greater damage. Aboard the warships, men were deafened by the din of solid shot pounding and breaking the iron plates and splintering heavy timbers, while shells screamed and whistled in the rigging, bursting, raining fragments. Foote's flagship, the prime target, was struck 32 times in the course of the action. Two of her guns disabled and her stacks, boats, and after cabin riddled. The captain of the ironclad on her left, which took 30 hits, said of one shot which he saw strike the flagship, "It had the effect, apparently, of a thunderbolt, ripping her side timbers and shattering the splinters over the vessel. She did not slacken her speed, but moved on as though nothing special had happened." Not so the luckless Essex. Patched up from the hurt she had received 2 days ago, she took another now through her boiler, an unlucky shot which left her powerless in a cloud of escaping steam. With 28 scalded men aboard, some dead and others dying. Out of control, she swung broadside to the current, then careened, leaving a gap in the line of battle, and drifted downstream out of the fight. Encouraged by this proof that the turtleback monsters could be hurt, the defenders cheered and redoubled their efforts. But they had done their worst, in fact, their all. For now, there followed a series of accidents and mishaps which abolished whatever chance they had for victory at the outset. Only two of their guns could really damage the ironclads, the high-velocity 6-inch rifle, which had already proved its effectiveness, and a giant Columbiad, which made for its lack of range by the heft of its 128-pound projectile. The rest, low-sighted as they were, with their muzzles near the water, could do no more than bounce their 32 and 42-pound shells off the armored prows of the attackers. First to go was the rifle, which burst in firing, disabling not only its only crew, but also those of the flanking pieces. Next, the big Columbiad was spiked by a broken priming wire, and thus put out of action. Despite the efforts of a blacksmith who attempted to repair it under fire, of the 7 cannons left, which could only dent the armor and shiver the timbers of the gunboats, 1 had to be abandoned for lack of ammunition, and 2 were wrecked almost at once by enemy shells. That left 4 guns to face the fire of the attackers, the range now being closed, almost point blank, and even those 4 were served by skeleton crews scraping together from among the survivors. These included Tillman. The fort commander had returned from seeing the infantry off, and was serving as a cannoneer at one of the 4 pieces. He had asked the artillerist to hold out for an hour, affording the garrison that much of a head start on its march to Donelson. Now that they had held out too, with the long odds growing longer all the time, the tactical consideration had been sacrificed twice over, and those of honor as well. He ordered the flag struck. It was done, and the firing ceased. The casualties were low, with 42 on the Union side and 21 on the Confederate side. Fort Henry was one of the first major Union victories in the war and had a significant impact on Union morale in the bleak months following the rout at Bull Run and the defeat at Wilson's Creek. The fall of Fort Henry also opened the upper Tennessee to the Union and set the stage for the fall of Fort Donelson roughly 1 week later.